Okay, thank you so much for your invitation. I think it's really a great honor. What I'm going to present today is actually part of an ongoing project that I'm working on right now on the subject about religious prisoners, Christian religious prisoners in China right after the Communist Revolution. So for today, what I'm going to do is actually to use the story of Watchman Nee as a case study, basically trying to illustrate, a number of issues regarding church and state relation, and also, and also to look at the subject about the making of martyrdom, within the context of Chinese and also Asian Christianity as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just, give a little bit more background about the origin of this project. And then I'm going to, maybe just, rely on some of the slides, just to illustrate some of the text, some of the passage that I use, from Watchman Nee's writings. First of all, I would say I think whenever we look at, modern East Asia, especially, the churches in the 20th century, I would say in the pre-modern East Asian world, most of the government, they seldom achieve a total control over its own population, especially in the countryside. So I think time and time again in countries like Japan, China, and Korea, there were many different periods of the violence crackdown on the early Catholic mission. The most famous story is the 26th Martyr of Japan, in the Nagasaki area. But right after this kind of violent crackdown, I think the Catholic faith managed to survive, and mainly because I think most of the missionary and also some of the local religious faithful, they just stay quietly and they basically just carry on their faith practice. The good example is the Japanese Catholic in Nagasaki and also nearby area since the 16th and 17th century. Some of them actually become what historians call the hidden Christian, the hidden Catholics until the 19th century. But the interesting thing is, I think when we get into the early 20th century, especially right after the First World War, many modern East Asian states, they embrace a radical revolutionary nationalism. And I think in the case of China, you actually have a much more powerful and authoritarian state. So I think in that kind of new political climate, the secular state tend to perceive Christianity as subversive, and they would actually mobilize all its resources to marginalize, persecute, and even to destroy the indigenous Christian community. Watchman Nee is actually one of these, very fascinating case study. It actually allows historians to study the tension between a well-established indigenous Christian community and also an indigenizing Marxist communist state. Just right after the end of the Second World War. So I think, a little bit background about the source material that I'm going to use for my research on Watchman Nee. I think one of the methodological challenge for Chinese historians who work on the story about religious prisoners is most of the government's archives are not yet open. I think especially in China. I think when we think about archives, within the context of modern China, archives was a very important part of the state control. Okay, so whenever the government, especially after 1949, whenever the government want to single out and target certain individual or community, the first thing that they will do is to build an archives, about the individuals. So the more famous and also the more controversial you are, the more government, the more information the government, will have about you. And so in a way, I think for Watchman Nee and also for many other marginalized Christian community, the government actually accumulate tons of materials about their personal history, family history, and also their involvement within the church. Not many of these materials are being released to scholars for research. So I was lucky enough to get hold of some of this report in some of the local, regional archives. But still, I think there's still tons of materials about the Christian prisoners and also the martyrs. Most of these, official materials are still controlled by the state. So I think for me, apart from using some of the official reports about, the Watchman Nee and his followers, I also rely a great deal on the memoir, the testimonies that was actually written by his family relative and also by his prison cellmate. okay, someone that he met in the Chinese labor camp, and he actually helped to convert that person. And later on, I think that person came to the United States as an asylum seeker, and I think he wrote down his encounter with the Watchman Nee. So we basically just rely on all this kind of secondary literature to reconstruct, the story of Watchman Nee, what happened to him, basically during the time of the persecution. Now, for the purpose of today's presentation, I also draw on many published writings, by Watchman Nee before the Communist Revolution. He is actually one of the most prolific writer in early 20th century China. And I think what he did was, after his death, basically his followers gather, translate, and also publish all his literatures online. So in a way, I would say, for Watchman Nee, surprisingly, I think before the Communist Revolution, he actually produced lots of articles and sermons on the subject of martyrdom, but sometimes I do wonder whether his teaching on martyrdom really prepared him to embrace that journey after the Communist Revolution. Now, for the purpose of this, I think in today's talk, what I'm going to do is basically try to cover some of this area. First of all, I'm going to define this term about martyrdom, within the context, of China. In the second part, I'm going to, talk a little bit more about, his life, Watchman Nee as a historical figure in modern China. And then later on, I'm going to, review some of his writing and references about, martyrdom, especially his, Bible, to look at, his Bible reading strategies and how he actually used some of the biblical passage, to encourage his followers to face, a very uncertain political future. And the last part is actually to talk about the whole process of memory production within the community of Watchman Nee's, local church movement, and also what does that mean for the Chinese church nowadays in the early 21st century. First of all, about the term martyr or martyrdom. I think within the Chinese language, I would say at the time of the Confucius, I think that was the term that they used, Shun Dao. Basically, that is the term that actually come very close to the Western concept of the martyrdom. Initially, for one of the early Chinese thinker, Mencius, when he talked about, Shun Dao, these ideas about, to martyr or to die for your cause, he basically referred to three different types of action. The first one is actually, to be sacrificed, in religious ritual, and basically to accompany the dead, the spirit of your Lord to the next life. The second element is actually to sacrifice yourself as a personal protest against any unjust regime. And the last part is basically just to follow a major ideal and also personal belief, to the end. Now, within the early Chinese Confucius tradition, they actually discouraged this practice of martyrdom, mainly because I think they have no ideas about what is going to happen to you after death. And I think for most of the early Confucius thinkers, they did not really take this concept about afterlife very seriously. And I think Confucius himself, he once said to his disciple, while you do not know about what happened in this life, why should you know about life after death? So I would say, within the Confucius tradition, what they really emphasize is actually a moral and decent life in this world. And they often encourage their followers to pursue a virtuous self on earth and also trying to use their talents to build an orderly society and also to help the king to establish good governance. So within the context of Chinese Confucianism, living a decent life now is actually better than dying for a just cause or for a moral cause. But the interesting thing is, I think by the time when the 17th century and 16th and 17th century, when you have the Catholic missionary, especially the Jesuit, when they come to China, it was actually through the process of translation, they actually picked these two Chinese characters to talk about the Western concept, the Christian concept of martyrdom. I think what they did was, they appropriate this Chinese word, but at the same time, they also, enrich it by talking about redemption and also salvation as well. So this is actually one of the major linguistic contributions of the Christian movement, within the Chinese history, by Christianizing, certain Chinese vocabulary, and also by, by introducing some new theological meaning behind that. But still, I think for the first generations of the Chinese Catholics, and also later for the first generations of the Chinese Protestant, they also face an intellectual gap, really to make sense of this Western concept of martyrdom. Especially they were coming from a traditional, Confucius tradition. I would say it was actually until the time of the Boxer uprising, that was, at the turn of the 20th century, when you have a series of anti-missionary and anti-Chinese Christian violence that actually took place in northern China from 1899 to 1900. Tens of thousands of Christians lost their life on both sides, the Catholic and the Protestant. And there were also many stories about Christian martyrdom under the Boxer violence. To many secular historians, whenever we look at this period of the Boxer uprising, I think historians often classify these victims of Boxer violence as people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the Boxer victims, especially the Christian victims, they actually represent the first generations of the Chinese Christian who actually died for their faith in a time of extreme violence. And I think to the people in the 20th century, like Watchman Nee, I think they often refer to the story of the Boxer martyr to talk about the importance and also the practice of martyrdom in a Chinese Christian context. So I would say the Boxer, I think the Boxer period, it marked as a kind of turning point. At least it actually provides some kind of theological reference for the early 20th century Chinese Christian writer to theorize and also to theologize the whole teaching about martyrdom. Now, around the same time, as the communist ideology also spread to China, I think the communist state, they also create their own term of, martyrdom to glorify the revolutionary martyr. But one of the major differences, within the Chinese communist, political discourse is whenever they talk about all this, revolutionary martyr, they often use it in a collective sense. So basically, the revolutionary martyr as a collective entity, they sacrificed themselves for the state. They lost their life in order to achieve the socialist, utopia on earth. While as for people like Watchman Nee and also for many early 20th century Chinese Christian writers, later on, I think whenever they use the term martyrs, they always want to highlight the individualistic aspect and also, the major elements about the human agency in the whole experience. Now, the second part of my talk is just, to give a historical overview about Watchman Nee as a person. I think Watchman Nee, he actually came from a strong Anglican family background. He's a third generation Anglican himself. I think his grandfather, his paternal grandfather was the first convert, to the Anglican Church in his hometown. And he was also become the first ordained Chinese pastor in the northern part of the Fujian province. But I think for Watchman Nee, I think his father worked for the British in the Chinese customs service. So as he was growing up, I think he came from a relatively well-off and also a well-established family background. I think Watchman Nee, he also attended the local Anglican college, the Trinity College in Fuzhou. But at the age of 17, in 1920, he experienced an emotional experience of conversion, thanks to the work and also the preaching of a very famous, Chinese, evangelist, Dollar Yu. After that emotional conversion experience, he decided to give up his academic learning, and he just wanted to become like Dollar Yu, to become, an evangelist, to spread the gospel. And I think a few years later, he came to know another, Anglican, missionary. Her name is Margaret Barter. But I think at that time, Margaret, she embraced the teaching of the Brethren movement. So she returned to China and basically trying to introduce the Brethren's teaching, especially the writings of John Nielsen Darby, to the Chinese. And I think Watchman Nee was so impressed by that writing. And he basically just left his hometown and basically moved to Shanghai to work with Margaret Barter. And later on, I think, Watchman Nee, worked with a group of young evangelists, people coming from his background, the third or the fourth generations of the Christian convert. They travel around the local, mission churches, try to, reconvert the church member to a much more revivalist message of Christianity. And I think sometime in the late 1920s, I think Watchman Nee, he began to organize a new religious movement called the local church. Initially, I think, he just wanted to, reestablish some kind of reformed church movement within the Anglican circle. But later on, I think, mainly because he was very much inspired by the Brethren movement, he began to see his own local church movement as a kind of breakaway, as a return to the ideal church, that was actually mentioned, that was actually recorded in the books of Acts. And to Watchman Nee, I think he actually see the local church very much as a spiritual entity. His followers, his members were called out of this world to serve God. They are part of this world, but they are not of this world. And I think for the Watchman Nee, I think when he organized his local church movement, he also rejected the traditional hierarchy between the clergy and also the laity as well. So I think for Watchman Nee, the local church movement or the local assembly, it was very much a reaction against the Anglican heritage that he grew up with. So whatever he really wanted to reform is actually the traditional institutional practice that he saw in the Anglican church. So for Watchman Nee, from 1950, throughout the 1920s, 30s, and also throughout the time of the Second World War, he basically just took his message from South China to Southeast Asia, and he basically just traveled around and also trying to spread his teaching about the local church and also about the importance of individual and also spiritual conversion. One of the interesting thing about his local church movement is I think the kind of Christian gospel that they try to propagate is a millennial Christianity. I think they emphasize a great deal on personal salvation. I think he also encouraged his followers to reject all the good things in this world. And I think they should be prepared for any kind of difficult times, especially at the time of the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, all this kind of religious teaching, it was very much a response to the culture of fear and anxiety in early 20th century China because of the war, revolution, and regime change. That types of the Christian message tend to actually appeal to many serious, religious faith seekers. Now, for Watchman Nee, before the communists, came to China, I think he grew his movement within the existing mission church circle. So basically, he traveled to all the major urban cities, trying to convert or encourage the member of the local Anglican, Methodist, and Presbyterian church to live the mission and to join his movement. And he also trying to basically promote a much more egalitarian form of church governance. And so I think by the time of the Communist Revolution, in 1940, within the Chinese Protestant, population, you had about 1 million Chinese Protestant, but about 80,000 of them proclaim themselves to be the active members of the local assembly. Now, the number is very small, but they are everywhere across the country. So they were basically everywhere in all the major metropolitan cities. And the other thing is, they also reject any type of material and also institutional connection with the Western mission. So it actually makes them, one of the most indigenous and also one of the most self-supporting and also self-managing Christian movement in the mid-20th century China. And because of their own organizational, network, and also because of the geographical spread, it actually makes them such a suspicious target, at the beginning of the communist regime. The other thing about Watchman Nee was, he was already a very famous, writer. I think he published, he was one of the Christian writer who actually made good use of modern printing to propagate his own work. So I think for Watchman Nee, by the time that, the communists came over, so I think they want him to join the state-controlled free self-patriotic movement. I think for the communist regime after 1945, I think when they first, established their, I think when they first came to power, I think they want to co-opt most of the denominational churches and also the indigenous group into the state-controlled religious patriotic institution. And initially, Watchman Nee and his followers, they actually joined the state because they thought that maybe the communist, formula for church and state relationship is one of collaboration rather than confrontation. But after he joined it, and he realized that the communists actually want to have a direct control over the spiritual affairs of the church, Watchman Nee and his followers, they decided to withdraw themselves from the state-controlled religious patriotic movement. And so it was around that time, in 1950 and 1951, so you began to see that the state actually really see Watchman Nee and his followers as a major target and also as a major trouble as well. And for Watchman Nee, he was actually arrested by the state in 1952, and he was actually put in a detention center. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, in 1956, and that is actually where he stayed, from 56 up to 1969, a major prison in Shanghai. And I think in this prison, Tilanqiao prison, you also have many other high-profile, Christian religious prisoners, like the Catholic bishop and also many other Jesuits and also Seventh-day Adventists and Baptists. They were all locked up, in this physical space for decades. Now, what we know about, Watchman Nee's life inside the prison is actually through the testimony of his cellmate. Now, for Watchman Nee, he has bilingual skill. So in the early 1950s, for the communists, they're always looking for people with bilingual skill to help them to translate all the scientific manual from English into Chinese. So basically, the first group that they look at is all these political and religious prisoners. So I think for Watchman Nee, he was actually given the task to translate many scientific manual, chemistry manual into Chinese. So that actually saved him from doing all this hard and also manual labeling work inside the prison. And the other thing is, I think as a charismatic religious leader, the prison officer also asked Watchman Nee to coordinate all the political study sections. So basically, he was actually a team leader in his own prison cell. He just supervised all the roommates to complete all the daily work and also to participate in the ideological education. So he basically applied the same Bible study skill to study the communist ideology, to study the communist text. And it was actually in this political study section that Watchman Nee began to identify potential converts and also to build his own network and also for support inside the prison wall. And his cellmate, Wu Yaoqi, it was actually through this context that he got to know Watchman Nee. And also sometime in 1969, Watchman Nee and his cellmate, they were actually sent to a labor camp, very far away from Shanghai. And I think the condition at the labor camp was much more worse than in an urban prison. So he was subject to many public trial and humiliation. And I think the government always, want to force him to denounce his faith. But most of the time, I think Watchman Nee, refused to give up. And sometime on May 30th, 1972, I think, Watchman Nee, I think his health deteriorated, and I think he died of some kind of heart trouble. By the time that, I think on the day of his death, Watchman Nee was believed to have written a note about his faith and put it under his pillow. And when his niece came to collect his belongings, she basically found this note in her uncle's belonging. Basically, I think in Chinese writing, I think Watchman Nee wrote, Christ is the Son of God, who died for the redemptions of sinners and who resurrect after 3 days. This is the greatest truth in this universe, and I die, because of my belief in Jesus Christ. Because of his opposition to the state, I think he was arrested in 1952 and stayed behind the prison bar for 20 years. And during that time, I think he not only put his own belief of the Christian God above the secular authority, but also subject the secular authority to the spiritual judgment of the divine. But of course, I think for people like Watchman Nee, he did not survive the concentration camp. He did not survive the imprisonment. So he could not imagine 20 years later, I think his notes would be published outside China, and it would also be translated into many different languages. And although this day, I think the communist state refused to readjust the case of Watchman Nee, but I think the Little Fork movement, the local church movement that he helped to build almost a century ago, it continues to grow both inside and outside China. And nowadays, I think that movement also becoming a little bit more multilingual and also multicultural. Now, in the third part of my presentation is I'm going to draw on some of Watchman Nee's early teachings on the martyrdom, and basically trying to get a sense of how these thinkers perceive martyrdom through his own study of the Bible and also the church history. First of all, I would say Watchman Nee is probably the first Chinese and also the Asian church leaders who actually coordinate a systematic program of discipleship and also leadership training in the early 20th century. Just right before the Communist Revolution, he organized two important sections, leadership training sections on the subject about martyrdom. And I think for Watchman Nee, most of this lecture, most of his notes on martyrdom was actually compiled and gathered by the people who attend the leadership sections. And it was later discovered, and it was also being published and also posted online as well. So when you think about, I think whenever we think about Watchman Nee's writing, it was the direct response to the culture of a revolutionary nationalism in China's national politics. And his writings were actually intended to encourage and also to manage his own church movement. So I think his writing, it was not really intent for theological discussion among armchair scholars. I think he focused a great deal on practice, everyday practice. And I think historian Paul Zhang, he summarized some of Watchman Nee's teaching by emphasizing ethics and practice are the two sides of the same coin. They were actually at the center of Watchman Nee's theological system. And basically, I think the basic preference is always, for the practical application rather than the speculation. And historian Daniel Bays, he also, emphasized that, he also bring out, this interesting element about Watchman Nee's writing, about the emphasis on the spiritual victory over the evil and also over the trial of the world. And one thing that is interesting is, I think Watchman Nee, he also, refer to his followers and also some of the potential martyrs as the overcomers, the victors, who are going to be in union with Christ and God in the timeless New Jerusalem. So I think for Watchman Nee, I think his approach to martyrdom, it was deeply biblical and also Christ-centered. And he often referred to some personal history to formulate his own teaching about martyrdom. One example is actually the anti-Christian violence that actually took place in China during the 1925. It was actually the first anti-Christian violence organized by the Communist Party, when they were actually in opposition. And I think in one of these, cases of anti-Christian violence, his brother-in-law referenced Lin Puqi, an Anglican pastor. He was also, the head of the Trinity College in Fuzhou. He was actually being harassed, by the anti-Christian student. He was humiliated. He was actually being carried around in the public street for punishment. It was reported that Watchman Nee, might have witnessed that event. And I think for Reverend Lin, he actually studied in Philadelphia at the turn of the 20th century. So during the 1930s and 40s, basically Reverend Lin moved to live with Watchman Nee in Shanghai. So they spent much time discussing the challenge of the nationalism facing the Chinese churches. And I think for Watchman Nee, he was well aware of the excessive violence that the excessive violence, facing the Christian believers in the 1920s when he first built his movement. And right before the communists take over, he organized these, two leadership sections. And when we look at the writing of Watchman Nee, especially on his teaching about martyrdom, he often referred to this special passage in the Revelation, the chapter 2 Revelation, in one of those letters to the churches in the Asia Minor. And I think he often, referred to the letters to the church in Smyrna, basically Revelation chapter 2, verses 10, do not fear the things that you are about to suffer, be faithful until death, because Christ will give you the crown of life. So I think for Watchman Nee, I think whenever he talk about this passage, especially the ideas about being faithful until death, I think he, as I quote, from Watchman Nee, I think it showed that the Christian God actually want martyrs, within the Chinese church. Whenever a Chinese believer face persecution and threat to his life, he or she should remain faithful until the last moment, and also he or she should be ready to sacrifice, his or her life. So I think to Watchman Nee, I think he believed that I think God's requirement is nothing less than our physical sacrifice. For Watchman Nee, he never elaborate whether this Christian God is a violent God or a merciful God. But I think through his reading of the Revelation chapter 2, he often believed that, persecution can actually happen without any warning. And I think in his own writing, he also mentioned that, there is always a sequence, in the level of violence that might occur to the Christian followers, the intensities of the persecution. It will begin with some kind of verbal abuse, and then it will be followed by physical violence, psychological abuse and torture, and finally imprisonment. And I think according to Watchman Nee in his own writing, I think he talked about the purpose of these types of, imprisonments. The first ultimate goal is to stop the Christian from practicing their faith in public. The second one is actually to separate them, to isolate them, and also to weaken the foundation, the physical foundations of the church. And the third one is actually to cause excessive pain and suffering to the Chinese, to the Christian followers. And I think for Watchman Nee, he often referred to the Revelation chapter 2 to articulate and also to formulate his own theology of suffering, during the time in preparing his followers for any potential danger. Now, according to Watchman Nee, human agency is definitely behind the Christian martyrdom, and I think he often referred to the early church history and also the story about the Protestant Reformation to talk about the human courage and also the determination to embrace all this danger. And I think in Watchman Nee, I think he often referred to the early church, the story of the early Christian martyr as a kind of cosmological struggle between good and evil, between the forces of Satan and also the forces of God. In one of the training sections before the Communist Revolution, Watchman Nee, he also developed this position, he advocated this position of political non-engagement. Now, he never, based on the sources that we have, he never directly comments on the upcoming communist threat to the church. But when he articulated this concept about the political engagement, he basically just draw on his reading of the gospel, saying that I think the Lord Jesus was on this earth. He never tried to confront the secular, the civilian, the civil authority, and also Lord Jesus did not get involved in politics. So that might be I think that should be the position that most of the Chinese Christian need to uphold. And also, he also referred to the chapter 6, the Revelation. It actually talked about, basically the final judgment. I think, by the time when, the Christian followers, they follow the footsteps of the early Christian martyr and also Lord Jesus Christ, I think they should not actually, fall prey to any type of political agenda. I think their ultimate goal is to advance the kingdoms of God, basically to be in this world, but also not of this world. Now, nothing in Watchman Nee's writing and teaching actually suggests his followers to resist the secular regime, they should resist the government, and also even though when they were facing a severe danger of persecution. But the interesting thing is, I think when politics actually came to affect him personally, as the Chinese government arrested him and also denounced him in public, Watchman Nee was reported to have remained calm and quiet, and he basically just admit, basically he just admit that he would never let go his faith. Now, for Watchman Nee, he never romanticized, the whole, concept about martyrdom. I think during the training section, he actually encouraged his church leader to promote and also to publicize this concept of martyrdom, even among the new converts, among the new members of the church. And here he actually drew on the teaching about the secret rapture, something that he borrowed from Darby to encourage his followers. Now, in Watchman Nee's writings, he characterized the group of Christian martyrs into two different, categories. The first group were the historical martyr over the last 2,000 years, basically, the well-known Christian martyrs in the church history. So this group of the martyr, the first group, they will be resurrected from the death, when Jesus came, when Jesus returned. The second group is actually the martyr during the great trial, the time when God's people will face severe punishment and also suffering for their faith. But these contemporary martyrs are the ones who refuse to worship the beast and also to have mark on their forehead and also on their hand. So I think Watchman Nee emphasized that for the second group of the martyr, they will be raptured alive. And I think that rapture moment will actually save them, from unbearable torture and also unbearable danger. Now, if we look at, the receptions of this kind of writings, sometimes we do wonder, what does his followers see in Watchman Nee's interpretations of the secret capture? It might actually require them and also inspire them to be a little bit more courageous and also determined to endure all types of suffering in the times of persecution. After all, I think the suffering will be intense, but I think the sufferer, I think the victim, they must also be prepared themselves for being taken to see the Lord. So it gives them a glimpse of hope in the most difficult moment. And the last thing about Watchman Nee is, he also trying to publicize, the practice of martyrdom as a kind of, everyday Christian life. I think for Watchman Nee, I think he actually see, the Christian must possess, ordinary Christian, every Christian, they must possess this spirit of martyrdom, in which I think they are actually dying for Christ in their daily following of Jesus Christ. So everyday self-denial, but at the same time being prepared, to embrace death in the most difficult moment. So there was a very interesting performative aspect, both at the individual and also at the collective level as well. And of course, I would say whenever we think about some of this Watchman Nee's writing to talk about martyrdom as a everyday of life. All this actually happened before his arrest and also before his, imprisonment. So for historian, when we evaluate, the role of Watchman Nee as a religious martyr, we have to look at the subjective and also the sympathetic criteria as well. And definitely, I would say for Watchman Nee, whenever he talk about martyr, he tend to take a much more narrow definition. Basically, the people who actually embrace, the physical death for their faith, they would be qualified to become a martyr. But for those people who confess their faith, who survive the whole persecution experience. So this is what we call the religious confessor, the Christian confessors. According to Watchman Nee, they are good, but they are not becoming martyr. They are not classified to become martyr. So finally, I just want to say a few words about the whole process, about memory production. Now, Watchman Nee died in 1972. Basically, for a spiritual figure like himself, he does not really care about his own legacy. It was actually many years after his death. Basically, people from outside of China, they wonder what actually happened to him. So the news of Watchman Nee's death came to his followers in Hong Kong and Taiwan in 1972, and also 1 year later to the Brethren movement in London. So at that moment, the people, the churches in the West and also in Hong Kong, they thought that the Chinese church were already dying under 3 decades of the socialist revolution. So what they really want to do is, they actually want to keep alive the history and also the spiritual writing of Watchman Nee, both in the Chinese and also in the English-speaking world. So there was a global collaboration, I would say, between the local church movement and also the Brethren, community in England. They decided to gather all the letters and publications of Watchman Nee, translate them, publish them, and also make them available in English and also in Chinese. I think the famous, books written by, Angus Kinnear, Against the Tide, the story of Watchman Nee, it was very much the outcome of this, global initiative. And of course, I think, for the local church outside China, they still know very little about the fast-growing house church movement that was actually initiated by Watchman Nee's followers in different parts of China during the 1960s and 70s. So all this effort initially, they were basically just trying to promote and also to keep alive the memory of Watchman Nee. Now, there's one problem in some of this, I would say the Christian writings, on the story of Watchman Nee and also many other religious prisoners. I think there's one tendency that they try to portray themselves, portray these, Christian martyr and religious prisoners as courageous individuals who are willingly to die and also to suffer for their faith. But whenever we look at some of this testimony as a historical document, I would rather like to see them as a very powerful critique of the Maoist dictatorship. Because I think by reading some of this religious testimony, you begin to see there were multiple identity of these religious prisoners. As religious figures, they appeal to their biblical understanding and also their theological upbringing they appeal to their Christian upbringing and also to their biblical knowledge to develop their own critiques against the socialist value and norm. But at the same time, I think as a historical person, they also rely a great deal on support, both inside the prison and labor camp and also outside for self-empowerment and also for encouragement as well. And also by comparing all this, religious testimony across different denominational lines, we also see that, people coming from different religious traditions, they also tend to embrace different faith practice to overcome this period of persecution. I think when I look at the writing of many Catholic Jesuits, they actually, rely on this on the discipline of spiritual exercise in the time of the persecution, really to find meaningful. Basically to find a spiritual meaning in their everyday survival. For the Seventh-day Adventists, they often observe the traditional practice of Sabbath keeping, the Saturday Sabbath keeping, even in the labor camp as well. So in a way, I think what Watchman Nee did, it actually represents, how he experienced and also, his personal story, it actually represents small factions of a larger picture. Basically, he actually provides some kind of a more fundamentalist and also a much more evangelical approach to utilize the Bible and also maybe trying to come up with effective strategy to deal with the fear and also the danger of persecution. And the last thing I want to see is, for many historians and also political scientists, I think when they look at the story of Christian religious prisoners, they actually realize that most of these people, they actually operate in a much more limited, in a much more a constrained state-controlled environment. There's nothing they could do to overthrow the authoritarian regime, but nevertheless, I think through their own story, through their own alternative experience, they actually reveal a glimpse of hope among themselves and also provide a kind of alternative approach for people who want to defend their own individuality in the most hostile, culture. So For people who survived the religious, persecution, including some of the Catholic father, I think during the interview they often refer to the experience of, suffering 吃苦. They use this, Chinese terminology to talk about their suffering, and this is actually one of the quotes that I got, from one of the interview with a Catholic father. He said, when we were bombarded with all this kind of anti-Christian propaganda, we have tasted the bitterness of the anti-Christian propaganda, but we survive. Okay, we survive. We have tasted, we survive, and so it also gets us to think about the meaning of the martyrdom within the context of contemporary China. Is in order for martyrdom to work, basically the future generations of the Christian followers, they need to revisit the historical experience and also maybe trying to insert the new meanings to the story of Watchman Nee. I would say, in the process of the post-Mao religious revival, I think both the government-run patriotic church and the house church movement, they want to move beyond the story of religious persecution, and they also want to try to find some kind of common theological ground to rebuild the Christian landscape during the 1980s, 90s, and also early 2000s. So people read about Watchman Nee, but they did not actually see his story as a theological resource to historicize and also to describe and also to explain their current situation. And also during the 1980s and 90s, there was also a strong popular interest in the whole subject about the gospel of prosperity. After all, China was modernizing and globalizing, so the new generations of the urban Chinese Christian convert, they were more interested in the material return of the whole conversion experience. But it was actually just only after a few years ago, since 2014, you began to see the Chinese state began to restrict the religious autonomy of the Chinese Christian community. And there were also a systematic movement to remove the cross, to destroy the physical institution of the house church, the unregistered church, and also even the government patriotic church. So nowadays, among many government patriotic, clergy and also the house church leader, they began to revisit the story of Watchman Nee and also trying to draw on some inspiration from the history of the 1950s and 60s to prepare them to encounter a much more uncertain future. So in order for martyrdom to work within the context of China, basically the future generations have to invest new meaning and also new interpretation into the historical experience. Thank you.